High in the rugged Pamir Range lies Lenin Peak, standing 7,134 meters tall, about 23,406 feet. For decades, it has carried a reputation that sets it apart from many of its neighboring giants. Unlike other massive summits with jagged walls and sheer cliffs, Lenin Peak appears broad and gently sloped from many angles. Its wide body and relatively accessible ridges earned it a reputation as one of the world's most climbable mountains, over 7 kilometers in height. For many, it seemed a safer proving ground, a place where experienced alpinists could hone their skills and where even ambitious beginners could dream of success. But that reputation hides a tragic irony. Despite its comparatively forgiving appearance, Lenin Peak has been the site of some of the most harrowing disasters in mountaineering history, including the single deadliest expedition ever recorded. What follows is the story of that catastrophe, along with other tragedies that shaped the mountain's legacy. Viewer discretion is advised. Lenin Peak straddles the border of modern-day Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, not far from China's western frontier. Before 1928, the summit was known as Mount Kaufman. In the years since, it has been renamed multiple times, including Peak Avicena by Tajik authorities in 2006, though the Kyrgyz still prefer Lenin Peak. Local peoples had their own names as well, each reflecting different traditions. For clarity, we'll stick with the name most climbers recognize, Lenin Peak. Its reputation for safety arose not without reason. Unlike peaks that can only be attempted via one or two routes, Lenin Peak offers over a dozen established approaches. Some are straightforward enough that novice climbers with preparation can succeed. Others are challenging, drawing seasoned alpinists looking for a true test. This variety, combined with its size, made Lenin Peak a magnet for climbers across the Soviet Union and beyond. At one point, it was even believed to be the highest summit in the Soviet Union, further cementing its allure. By the late 20th century, hundreds of expeditions had already reached its slopes. Camps had been carved into its glaciers and ridges. Climbing clubs, both professional and amateur, considered it a badge of honor. And in 1990, one particular gathering of climbers unknowingly walked into history. The early 1990s were a turbulent time for the Soviet Union. The cracks in the system were widening after the Chernobyl disaster and years of economic hardship. Yet life carried on in other ways. For many Soviet climbing clubs, that meant mountaineering expeditions. In the summer of 1990, Lenin Peak was chosen as the testing ground for candidates preparing for an even greater challenge, an official Soviet ascent of Mount Everest. Dozens of climbers from different clubs and even from outside the Soviet Union gathered on Lenin Peak. The plan was to climb the mountain, demonstrate their skills, and have the strongest chosen for the Everest mission. Among them was a legendary figure, Vladimir Baliberdin, the first Soviet mountaineer to stand on the summit of both Everest and K2. His presence lent the expedition both credibility and a sense of safety. After all, if anyone knew how to judge a climber's readiness, it was him. Lenin Peak in some ways resembled Everest in miniature. The standard north face route began with a long approach across glaciers, then wound upward in an S-shaped curve through multiple camps, before finishing along a sharp ridgeline to the summit. It was high enough to require acclimatization and supplemental oxygen, but not so technically demanding as Everest itself. For that reason, it was perfect for training. The expedition began in early July. Typically, summers on Lenin Peak are relatively mild. Being deep inland, it doesn't receive the heavy precipitation of other great ranges. Though glaciers and permafrost coat its flanks, climbers often remark that sunburn was a greater risk than frostbite. Some had even climbed to the summit in just a shirt and pants. The atmosphere seemed ideal. The climbers established their first major camp on a wide plateau known as the Frying Pan, about 5,300 meters high. The spot had long been considered stable. The last serious avalanche in the area had occurred 30 years earlier, and the Frying Pan was slightly offset from the main avalanche paths. For decades, it had served as a reliable camp for those ascending the north face. But in July 1990, nature had other plans. On July 13th, An unseasonal snowstorm swept across the mountain, burying its northern slopes in fresh snow. Though inconvenient, storms were not unusual, and the climbers simply waited it out. Once the skies cleared, nearly 50 members of the group pushed upward and reached the frying pan, where they began setting up their tents. Vladimir Baliberdin, however, felt uneasy. Experience told him conditions weren't right. After a short rest at the camp, he chose to descend back to base camp, accompanied by a friend named Boris and Boris's partner, Elena. Partway down, Elena began to feel ill from altitude sickness and stopped to rest, while Vladimir and Boris continued to base camp. Back at the frying pan, 45 climbers prepared for the night. Some cooked, some checked gear, others simply chatted, looking forward to the push ahead. But at 6:50 p.m., hundreds of kilometers away in the Hindu Kush Mountains, a powerful earthquake shook the earth. Though the climbers felt nothing, the tremor destabilized the ice on Lenin Peak. A massive serac, a vertical tower of ice, broke free. It crashed into the fresh snowpack, triggering an enormous avalanche. In seconds, millions of tons of snow thundered down the mountain, sweeping directly across the frying pan. Few had time to react. Most were buried instantly as walls of snow crushed tents and climbers alike. Only 2 survived. Alexei, a young climber, and his companion Miro had pitched their tent on the outer edge of the frying pan. When the avalanche struck, instead of being buried, they were hurled off the side of the plateau, tumbling 800 meters down the slope before slamming into a snowbank below. Miraculously, they lived, though battered and nearly stripped of clothing. Alexei staggered to his feet, bleeding and half-dressed, and spotted Miro trapped in the snow nearby. After digging him out, they realized the scale of their predicament. Nearly naked, injured, and stranded, they faced freezing to death unless they acted quickly. At first, they considered descending, but the cold was too intense. Instead, they climbed back toward the frying pan, hoping part of the camp might still be intact. When they arrived, the scene was nightmarish. The camp had been obliterated. Tents and equipment lay scattered. A few muffled voices could still be heard under the snow, climbers buried alive in their sleeping bags, but they were too deep to rescue. Powerless, Alexei and Miro salvaged scraps of fabric and clothing from the debris, wrapped themselves as best they could, and huddled together for the night. Meanwhile, below, Vladimir and others at base camp suspected disaster. As soon as the avalanche subsided, rescue parties began climbing toward the frying pan, though the unstable snow slowed progress. The next morning, Alexei and Miro set out to descend. Injured and half-frozen, they crawled and stumbled in dense fog, sometimes throwing snowballs ahead to gauge the terrain. At one point, Miro collapsed, unable to continue. Alexei gave him the warmest clothing they had left and pressed on alone, driven by sheer determination to live, and, as he later recalled, by the thought of drinking a glass of lemonade if he survived. Eventually, rescuers found him, clothed him, and brought him down to safety. They later recovered Miro as well, but he had succumbed to the cold. In the end, Alexei was the sole living survivor of the frying pan disaster. Out of 45 people, 44 perished. Helicopters and search teams scoured the slope, but the avalanche debris had hardened into ice, making recovery almost impossible. Only a handful of bodies were found immediately. The rest were swallowed by the mountain, remaining entombed for years until glacial melt began to reveal them decades later. Alexei himself returned in the 2000s to assist in recovery missions, helping bring back the remains of his lost companions for proper burial at a memorial near base camp. Among the dead were Soviet climbers, Czechoslovakians, Israelis, Swiss, and Spaniards. Entire clubs were devastated. To this day, many bodies remain on the mountain, reminders of the deadly night when Lenin Peak claimed its place in history. The 1990 avalanche remains the single deadliest mountaineering disaster ever recorded on one expedition. The 1990 event wasn't the first or last time Lenin Peak witnessed tragedy. In 1955, an early Soviet expedition lost 11 climbers on its slopes. In 1974, another disaster struck, claiming the lives of an all-female Soviet team led by the accomplished Elvira Shataeva. That expedition ended with desperate radio calls from the summit during a ferocious storm, their final messages hauntingly resigned. "See you in eternity." All 8 women perished. More recently in 2022, 2 climbers succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning after running a stove inside their tent during a storm. It was a simple mistake, something many mountaineers do despite warnings. But the snow blocked ventilation and they quietly slipped into unconsciousness, never waking again. These stories highlight a sobering truth. No mountain is ever truly safe. Reputations can be misleading. The more people who attempt a peak, the higher the odds that something will eventually go wrong. Lenin Peak may look tame compared to Everest, K2, or Annapurna, but it remains a giant of ice and stone. Its slopes hide both triumph and tragedy. For every climber who stands proudly on its summit, others lie forever beneath its snow.